Hello, everyone. Dr. Eames here. This time our topic is volunteers. Some basics, really. Let's get some terminology down. Volunteers are people who donate their time, their effort, and experience without receiving any money or payment in kind. And volunteers really do help employers and employees meet the organization's mission. So, in the nonprofit sector in particular, this is incredibly important. And this is where we generally see volunteers. We're not going to see large numbers of volunteers in the private sector at all. In fact, if any, we may see a few in the public sector where they go back and lend expertise after retiring or something like that. But generally, we're talking about volunteers in the nonprofit sector. So let's focus down on that particular perspective. And these volunteers need to be included as an item in your strategic planning. Volunteers are human resources, just like paid employees. And believe it or not, there is very strong competition between public agencies who do have some volunteers and those nonprofit organizations which completely rely on them for services and doing the jobs and the work of the nonprofit in particular. Volunteers are managed by the same practices that you use with regular employees. So standard HR practices apply. Managers, for instance, have to pay attention to the recruitment, the selection, the hiring, the evaluation, and the management of their volunteers. So just because they don't get paid doesn't mean that you don't manage them. Volunteers do not usually initiate the hiring process, believe it or not. In fact, there's a myth out there that volunteers are just beating down the doors of nonprofits and agencies that need them, and that's simply not the case. Volunteers have to be recruited, just like regular employees. And volunteers present challenges that are different from regular employees, obviously. So our human resource management policies have to be developed in ways that are very specific to include and to manage those volunteers who come and work for us. So strategies have to be developed to motivate and retain volunteers, just like regular paid employees. Here's a nice graphic that gives us a little bit of information about the impact of volunteers in 2014. Just some random demographics, but helpful statistics to help us understand how important volunteers really are. 55% of nonprofits really run an assessment to see how are they impacting our operations and how valuable to us and important to us are they. Once they run an assessment like that, we find that almost 20% increase their recruitment and retention as a result of learning this knowledge and acting on it. And just slightly over a third say the biggest problem they have is that the lack of resources prevent them from doing these assessments. And now an assessment simply is an evaluation. And you're always evaluating your regular employees, correct? So we're going to find that that is something you have to do with volunteers as well. And you can see here some of the ways that they do impact the organization. You can use them in all the metrics and when you're measuring things, and you can divide it up to productivity per paid staff versus volunteers and so forth. And certainly you will be gathering information about volunteers just like you do regular employees along the way. So you use the best practices for collecting data and you use the most current metrics to measure things and so forth. When it comes to the use of volunteers for public agencies in particular, they're an attractive resource, really. Normally, we are going to think of the volunteer in the context of nonprofit organizations, but these public agencies, many of them rely on volunteers to deliver services and to, for instance, foster community development and involvement wherever that impacts on the mission of the agency. So volunteers do work in public agencies. They don't cost anything, obviously, in terms of wages. They often provide specialized skills that are either in short supply or lacking completely. So in that sense, they also provide extra staff, but also extra staff for emergencies. And they do allow public agencies to provide services and even expand services when they have budgetary constraints and so forth. Volunteers are used on task forces of all types. They work in community recreation programs, libraries, and they are advocates often for community issues. And so some of the more visible occupations that are volunteer affected are policemen, firefighters, park rangers, even file clerks and office workers of all types. So although I have said that the main emphasis for volunteers is nonprofit work, and it certainly is in that sector, we don't want to overlook the vital contribution that they do make to public agencies. And there are also some associated costs, though, with volunteers, even though you're not paying them. You're certainly going to have to cover them by liability insurance, for instance, and you're going to have to take into account other risk management issues when it comes to volunteers. And because of the agency principle, organizations are liable for the actions of volunteers just as they are for paid employees. But we'll talk about some legislation, some recent legislation that modifies that a little bit. Um, Volunteers do need the same level of screening and scrutiny as any regular employee we get in the recruitment, selection, and hiring process. So volunteers should have to meet and fulfill specific job requirements just as any regularly paid employee would in that particular job, whether paid or not. So that raises the issue of training, and certainly volunteers are going to need training, and in particular an orientation, just like regular paid employees. Now, when it comes to paid staff and how they react to volunteers, well, particularly, usually what we see is that they're welcomed because employees know that they can't do all the work themselves and that they welcome this help from outside. But there can be some tension if volunteers are used to replace regular employees. And if your regular staff feels like an employer is using a volunteer to replace staff, you may find that you will have an exit of all your staff. Um, the use of volunteers shouldn't be for that. It should be to supplement the effectiveness of your paid staff, not to replace them. And you certainly need to make that clear to your paid staff so they don't feel any hidden tension under the surface that you're not aware of, that they are worried about that and you don't even know it. And in fact, it is an unethical organizational stance to use volunteers to replace skilled paid staff. Now let's talk a little bit about volunteer motivation. Why do individuals volunteer? Well, there are intrinsic rewards and there are certainly extrinsic rewards. And some are more obvious than others. Intrinsic rewards are those that we feel within ourselves. So satisfaction, sense of accomplishment, being challenged in a difficult task, those are intrinsic rewards. And also feelings that result from our cognitive processes. In other words, just thinking about what is going on, along with some emotional component, really is a reward for some people. Now, the extrinsic awards are external to us, so it might be that you're gaining some career or professional development as a volunteer. You're learning new skills. That's entirely possible. Some people volunteer for the opportunity to meet new people. Some people volunteer to give back to the community. So there are a variety of extrinsic rewards, even beyond that short list of three there. So, and we also have to acknowledge that people are individuals, and what motivates one volunteer certainly may not motivate another. We all have our own inclinations, our values, attitudes, and forces that drive our overall behavior. So we do have to keep in mind that volunteers are expecting some type of intrinsic or extrinsic reward for their efforts. So working without pay, in other words, doesn't mean working without exchanging some value. That means if we're going to rely on volunteers, we have to craft programs that provide the opportunity uh, that is satisfying and interesting to people. And maybe that will generate some intrinsic or extrinsic reward. So we have to be thinking about these things. Um, it also means we have to remember to give some form of acknowledgement or recognition of the donated time and skill. So why do people volunteer? Well, they want to have an impact, and I've mentioned some of the reasons, but sometimes it's other things like pressure from a friend or colleague, or hearing a friend or colleague talk about something they've done that they volunteered for, and it piques their interest, and maybe they feel it as pressure possibly, but maybe just that hearing about it we, gives them some type of awareness that makes them want to do that. Some people volunteer for recognition that they are giving back, and that's why it is important that we give acknowledgement. That way, we will stoke the fires of those intrinsic rewards they're enjoying and recognition. Indeed, some status from their specific knowledge, maybe, or whatever it might be, their skills. We always have to acknowledge that in some way. Some people volunteer as therapy for themselves, personal therapy for whatever reason. Others act out a fantasy of some type, how they are giving back after a long life of accomplishment or whatever. And it could be they're just in a mindset that they feel that it's time to give back to repay society or some particular venture because they feel they should. Some people volunteer out of guilt. It may be self imposed and it may not be. But these are all personal sorts of attributes and behaviors that we all do respond to and that do drive us. Now, when it comes to recruitment, there are all sorts of barriers, of course. The biggest one, I think, is lack of resources like time, money, information, or just skills in volunteer recruiting. Lack of opportunities, lack of personal interest, lack of transportation. Those are all volunteer barriers and challenges that have to be overcome. And so sometimes these are on the side of the volunteer themselves, and other times they are not. Some volunteers have had previously poor experiences doing volunteering, so that could be a reason. And so, uh, not understanding how they might benefit from the volunteering, the types of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards would be a fall down on the part of management. It could also be elements like lack of child's care or even low self esteem or lack of confidence in personal skills. And today, with our growing diverse workforce, you certainly could have some cultural or language barriers. And so we want to be careful of reacting to stereotypes about volunteers in general and about whatever ethnicities or gender we might have. We do not want people volunteering for all the wrong reasons, and we don't want to pick people for the wrong reasons. Now, where and how are volunteers recruited? Well, first of all, people need to know that you are looking for volunteers and that you value them. So, social media is taking an increasing role. Um, Word of mouth referrals from other volunteers or referrals from paid staff, for instance, are one way. Newspaper articles, in print advertisements, use radio and TV if you can afford it, or maybe you can get some donated time and other things. Presentations to community or professional groups, relatives, friends, mention that you need volunteers of a certain type and so forth. You really would be surprised at the power of word of mouth. Now, competition among public agencies and nonprofits for volunteers is a challenge because it makes recruiting difficult. There is a lot of competition out there. In other words, volunteers have lots of alternatives besides just your organization. Uh, Sometimes at the community level, databases do get created where online information is available about opportunities in the area and so forth. And potential volunteers do use those sources of information. You do want to create the right type of program. You need to establish a sound program if it's going to use volunteers, has a very recognizable structure and so forth, sets the boundaries of volunteer activities, and indeed has to very specifically lay out job duties. You have to have a job title, job duties, and all of the rest. Now, potential volunteers want to know as much detail as you can provide about what they are going to do. And that is just exactly what a regular employee will do, what you have to do with a regular employee. So um, it just makes it imperative that you get it right and that you think about the details of what you're creating. That we also have virtual volunteering, and this is the use of information and communicating and using technology to do the work at some location other than the organization. So just like we're using now, you can use Zoom to take care of a few things. Um, what we really want to do is just be careful, uh, organize things, and get everything right. In other words, use teleworking whenever possible. Now, this is becoming much more common all the time, letting people work from home. And if people work from home for wages, you could probably find a program or a way to use volunteers to work from home. You can use the internet to facilitate the use of the volunteers' talents and skill from home. And at the same time, the internet and social media that an organization can use to reach very large numbers of potential volunteers. And so your social media in itself will be a powerful recruiting tool if you use it that way. Now, the pre recruitment process really uh, is about doing first the identification of the types of skills or competencies that you need so you can determine what type of volunteer you need. So needed skills are going to vary tremendously. Sometimes they're basic skills. Other time they're more occupational or technologically related skills. So you have to ask yourself some basic questions. Do you need just generic office skills? How about coaching or mentoring skills? Do you need specialized skills like maybe writing a grant or administering an agency or supervising some process? And what about the time frame? How long will you need that volunteer? What are the hours each day? So what we get is an episodic volunteer first off. An episodic volunteer is someone who volunteers for a specific amount of time or a specific project with an established endpoint. So temporary is a type of episodic volunteer. And temporary means just that, service for a short duration, a few hours or days. An interim episodic volunteer provides service for a prearranged time period or a specific project or event, something like that, that has a limited and easily distinguishable time frame. And then the occasional episodic volunteer has regular intervals and short periods of time where they will show up uh, not just only for specific things, but uh, randomly. And so you can't always predict the behavior of these occasional episodic volunteers. They won't want to necessarily do the same event year after year, but they may show up for something else out of nowhere. And so these are repeat volunteers most of the time, but they're not necessarily volunteers who are going to have that steady job. So, what are the elements of your volunteer job description? Well, this is a review of information. This is exactly what we've talked about in recruitment, selection, and hiring. This is how you uh, delineate a job description. You put all the information in it, just like you would a paid employee, nothing different. When you manage your volunteers, you'll notice here that these elements are things that you would either track or, excuse me, or you would do these with any normal employee. And so these are the standard things that you can see on the slide here that any HR manager is going to do. And so it just reiterates what I said at the beginning that you need to do the same thing for volunteers and the same sort of management practices that you would for a paid staff. And you have to have a plan that addresses all of these items just like you would for paid staff. And some things are going to be exactly the same, like things like, for instance, rights and standards of conduct. Well, that's going to be the same whether you're paid or unpaid. Um, but volunteers are different. And so some of these may be slightly different and will have to be written differently because of who and what they are. Now, you must give orientation and training for volunteers, just like regular paid staff. So you start with onboarding. This is what we typically call an orientation. But it's about providing information mainly about the organization's history, its mission, its goals, and so forth. It's all part of a process of disseminating information and so forth. It should mention expectations for the volunteers' performance and how the volunteers should be told how their contributions further the mission of the organization. So they should know where they fit in, the importance of what they're contributing at any level, and so forth. Even if it's just that we just really need you because we don't have enough people, maybe the task itself isn't earth shaking, but it's important, it's significant, has to be done. Tell them that it is a vital function of what we do. Um, on the job training should be conducted exactly as the same way for paid staff. So training is usually needed for to some extent for hired paid staff, and so you should approach it exactly the same way for volunteer staff. This is a time during onboarding and on the job training where you can reduce tensions, socialize people, get down to the work of the organization. Now, orientation and training programs are usually very effective in socialization. They usually help you to keep turnover low. If you don't do these sorts of things, people will not stick around. They will not be impressed with your organization. They will not really feel like a good fit, and quite often. These programs and these types of activities are meant to inform and socialize into the organization. So we're really talking about doing the normal things any organization ought to be doing with and for a new employee. So when it comes to volunteer recognition, show appreciation. Recognition reinforces the value of the volunteer's efforts, and it's a way to help reinforce those intrinsic rewards they may be operating under. Give tokens of appreciation. Some examples would be a letter of appreciation, an award, have a picture of the volunteer, put in a newsletter, or put in a press release to the local paper that you will hope will print for free for you if you are a nonprofit agency. Uh, Place an article, a full-fledged article in a local paper or news media of some type. And there are the intangible rewards, of course, that you can give people that you do with paid staff. Praise. Praise from supervisors and paid staff is effective. It works. It motivates people. Uh, an intangible reward is to provide an opportunity, maybe an opportunity to train other incoming volunteers or even to train or work with paid staff. Um, Give them more responsibility to make very low level decisions or decisions that you know that they are capable of making. These are intangible things that just the sorts of things that you would do to empower employees who are paid. So you must also do the big bugaboo for a lot of managers, evaluating people and so forth. But evaluations are important because they do tell you what's going on. They tell you where you need to spend your time training and developing and offering opportunities. So evaluations accomplish the same purpose they do for paid staff. They inform the manager, they inform the volunteer, and they help keep things on track and going in the directions that you want. And of course, just like with paid staff, evaluations of any type should be objective, focus on specific job duties, and contain measurable things. Now, cope with a volunteer who does not meet your expectations. It should be handled exactly the same way as you would handle a low-performing paid employee. Um, Textbook offers actually a process that you can go through, but actually, as a manager, you should be competent as a first-level manager to use your intuition to know how to handle these sorts of personnel decisions. It does take time and experience, but there are guidelines to help you. So usually you want to find a solution that doesn't involve terminating the volunteer and at least give a person an opportunity to resign rather than terminate them. But often it might just be a problem or something you didn't know about in the workforce or something that's going on in the context of what's going on, and find out about it and see if you can help solve that particular problem. We do have one piece of legislation that talks about volunteers. Now, I said earlier on in the presentation that volunteers operate under the agency principle, whereas they are working for an organization, whether paid or unpaid, as so they are considered agents, and all their actions could means that the organization is liable for the things they do. Um, and that is true. We did get the Volunteer Protection Act in 1997, which offers for the very first time uh, some legal protection from liability, and the nonprofit themselves from liability for the actions of their volunteer workers. So it's about immunity, and it's slightly limited. What the Volunteer Protection Act says is that a nonprofit can't be held liable in a situation where the nonprofit's volunteer caused someone to be injured while helping the nonprofit. So this act applies only to uncompensated volunteers and not paid staff. So it does give a nonprofit a little bit of leeway from legal prosecution if something that results in a liability for the organization happens. Um, this is only though, and so let me give you the caveats and the restrictions on it. This is only immunity from claims of negligence, and this is only for the volunteer staff. It does not cover claims that are more serious. So we have, in the legal sense, negligence, but we also have gross negligence, and this does not cover gross negligence, anything that borders or is considered criminal conduct, and so forth. So there are some restrictions there. So I would say that we would perceive this as some limited immunity for the actions of volunteers. Okay, let's wrap this up with a few general conclusions. The first thing that we want to say is that volunteers are absolutely critical to the strategic side of your human resource management. They have to be included in the plan, and the impact and the reliance and dependence on them and so forth has to be completely spelled out and understood. Volunteers typically perform some tasks that otherwise wouldn't get done or would have to be handled by employees who might be already overworked. You do not want to create jobs and programs that are so terrible that they are the crappiest jobs in an organization that nobody wants to do. Believe me, volunteers don't want to do those sorts of things either. So you cannot craft a job or a program and expect a volunteer to get some sort of intrinsic or extrinsic reward out of it if it's just a terrible job. You will just experience extreme turnover, and you won't create a good experience, and it won't indeed enhance your reputation. So you have to make sure that the jobs you create are meaningful, and so forth. Um, you need to find ways to get your volunteers and your paid staff to work together. So you have to do the things that are necessary with onboarding and orientation programs and training and so forth to make sure that you create norms in your organization that welcome and indeed cooperate with and so forth with volunteers, so that they have a good experience and that you do benefit from their expertise. So when you are recruiting volunteers in particular, you want to focus just like you would with regular employees. When you hire them, you focus on KSOCs, key skills, abilities, and other characteristics as an HR manager that you identify and so forth. So volunteers have to have those same sorts of things in an unpaid job as a paid one. So they should receive training. And then let's wrap it up by saying that both a public agency and a nonprofit volunteer are going to need to and want to benefit from their experience. So you have to concentrate and really think about what are the underlying things that I can do to create some meaning in this job experience. Okay, folks, that's what I wanted to talk about this time. I'll talk to you again soon.